If you thought Heated Rivalry Season 2 was going to simply continue the Shane and Ilya story, think again, because the show has just made two major casting announcements that could completely change the emotional landscape of the next season. Justice Smith and Charlie Gillespie are officially joining Heated Rivalry Season 2, with Smith cast as Harris Drover and Gillespie taking on the role of Troy Barrett. And yes, this is important because Harris and Troy aren't random new characters. Their story comes directly from Rachel Reid's Game Changers universe and the book Role Model. Season 2 is now shaping up to be much bigger than just a continuation of Season 1. And before we break down exactly who these two characters are, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because we're going to be following every major Heated Rivalry Season 2 update as production continues. So, let's start with Justice Smith. Justice Smith is probably the more recognizable name to mainstream audiences. He's appeared in projects including Detective Pikachu, Jurassic World, Fallen Kingdom, and I Saw the TV Glow, and now he's stepping into the Heated Rivalry universe as Harris Drover. Harris is the social media manager for the Ottawa Centaurs, and that's already an interesting contrast to professional hockey players surrounding him. He isn't introduced as another superstar athlete. Instead, his position puts him close to the hockey world, while giving him a different perspective on the culture surrounding the team. And this is where I think the casting of Justice Smith gets really interesting. Harris needs to bring warmth, vulnerability, and emotional intelligence to the story. Justice Smith has already shown that he can handle characters who are emotionally complicated and somewhat introspective. So on paper, this feels like a very smart casting decision. But then we have Charlie Gillespie. Fans of Julie and the Phantoms will immediately recognize him. Gillespie is playing Troy Barrett, and Troy is arguably one of the most emotionally complicated new characters coming into the series. Troy is a hockey player who joins the Ottawa Centaurs, and his story is connected to the events and characters from Role Model and The Long Game. He's not simply there to provide another romantic storyline. Jacob Tierney has already teased that Troy is a deeply damaged character, and that the series intends to explore that side of him even more seriously. And personally, I think that's one of the most exciting things about Season 2. Season 1 worked because the chemistry between Shane and Ilya was at the center of everything. Their secrecy, rivalry, attraction, and emotional connection created a tension that made the show so addictive. But Season 2 has a different challenge. Shane and Ilya are no longer simply asking, "Do we want each other?" They're dealing with what happens after you actually build a relationship. That's a much more complicated story. Jacob Tierney has previously explained that Season 2 is moving into more serious emotional territory, with the adaptation drawing primarily from The Long Game while incorporating elements of Role Model. He has also described Troy as someone who is quite damaged, suggesting that his storyline won't simply be a lighthearted grumpy versus sunshine romance. And that is why Harris and Troy could become extremely important to the television adaptation. The writers have an opportunity to use their relationship to explore another side of the hockey environment, particularly questions about identity, vulnerability, masculinity, and what happens when people who are carrying emotional baggage are forced to confront it. Harris and Troy also give the series another romantic dynamic, without necessarily replacing Shane and Ilya. That's an important distinction. Because let's be honest, some fans might hear new couple and immediately worry that the show is moving away from the characters they became invested in. I don't think that's what is happening. Jacob Tierney has repeatedly emphasized that Shane and Ilya remain the heartbeat of the series. Instead, the world around them is expanding. And that makes sense when you look at the source material. Rachel Reid's Game Changers books aren't just about one couple. They're part of a larger interconnected universe, and Role Model gives Troy and Harris their own story, while The Long Game continues Shane and Ilya's journey. The television adaptation is therefore in an interesting position. It can tell two stories simultaneously, while allowing them to influence each other. And that's potentially much more interesting than simply trying to recreate Season 1. Now, let's talk about the release date. Season 2 is currently targeted for spring 2027. Current reporting has pointed specifically toward April 2027, although fans should distinguish between a targeted window and a formally announced exact premiere date. Production is getting underway in Toronto in August 2026, so we're still months away from actually seeing Justice Smith and Charlie Gillespie on screen. But casting them this early gives us a pretty strong indication that Troy and Harris aren't going to be insignificant background characters. And here's my prediction. I think the biggest challenge for Season 2 isn't going to be finding chemistry between the actors. It's going to be balancing the stories. You got Shane and Ilya, who remain the emotional core. You got Troy and Harris coming in with a relationship that has its own dramatic weight. And then you've got the larger world of professional hockey surrounding all of them. If the writers try to cram too much into too few episodes, some of these stories could feel rushed. But if they give Troy and Harris enough room to breathe, Justice Smith and Charlie Gillespie could become one of the biggest reasons viewers become even more invested in Season 2. And Charlie Gillespie is a particularly interesting choice because Troy requires more than simply charisma. The character needs someone who can communicate pain underneath the surface. That's the kind of role that can completely change how audiences see an actor. Justice Smith, meanwhile, gives the production performer with experience moving between major studio projects and more intimate, emotionally demanding work. So my overall reaction? I think this is a very promising casting combination. Justice Smith as Harris makes sense because Harris needs warmth and emotional accessibility. Charlie Gillespie as Troy could be even more intriguing because Troy appears to require a much rougher, more emotionally wounded performance. And if the chemistry between these two works, Season 2 could introduce a second relationship that audiences become just as emotionally invested in. But there's another reason I'm excited. Heated Rivalry became a phenomenon because it wasn't just about hockey or romance. It was about characters trying to figure out who they are while dealing with a world that doesn't always make that easy. Adding Harris and Troy gives the writers another opportunity to explore that idea from a completely different angle. And I think that's exactly what Season 2 needs. Not a copy of Season 1, something that evolves, something more mature, something that can surprise the audience. So, the big question now is simple. Will Justice Smith and Charlie Gillespie live up to the expectations surrounding Harris and Troy? We won't know until we see them on screen. But based on the characters they're playing, the source material they're adapting, and Jacob Tierney's comment about Troy's darker emotional journey, I think Season 2 has potential to be considerably more layered than fans are expecting. Justice Smith, Charlie Gillespie, Harris Drover, Troy Barrett, and a spring 2027 return for Heated Rivalry. The wait is officially getting very interesting. What do you think about the casting of Justice Smith and Charlie Gillespie? Do you think they were the right choices for Harris and Troy? And are you more excited for Season 2 now? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.